Hello. My wife had an affair with someone from work. I stayed quiet until she wrapped up her gala speech, then publicly exposed it and gave her divorce papers on stage. My name is Matthew. I am 38 and I work as a logistics coordinator for a regional food distribution company in Philadelphia. My job is mostly schedules, inventory reports, and making sure trucks actually arrive where they are supposed to. It is not glamorous work, but it is stable and it pays the mortgage. Most of my days start early. I am usually up before 6, checking overnight delivery updates before heading into the office near the warehouse district. By the time most people in the city are getting coffee, I have already dealt with 3 scheduling problems. My wife is Betty. She is 36 and works in corporate communications for a large consulting firm downtown. We have been married for 7 years and together for almost 10. Betty is the opposite of me socially. She thrives in rooms full of people, especially professional events. Her job involves managing public messaging for executives, organizing media appearances, and running high-profile company events. About 2 years ago, we bought a row house in South Philadelphia. The mortgage is manageable, and the commute works for both of us. For a long time, the arrangement felt balanced. My life was predictable and operational. Hers was built around networking, presentations, and visibility. Betty has always had a sharp personality. Confident is the polite way to describe it. Blunt is probably more accurate. She had a habit of talking to people like they were slightly inconvenient if they were not useful to her. That attitude showed up with waiters sometimes. Occasionally with co-workers she thought were incompetent. Every once in a while it showed up with me if she had a stressful day. I usually ignored it because I understood the environment she worked in. Corporate reputation jobs attract a certain kind of competitive personality, and Betty was very good at what she did. The first change I noticed was small. Betty started mentioning a coworker named Edward more often than anyone else at her office. At first it sounded completely normal. They were planning a large company charity gala together. According to Betty, it was one of the biggest events her department had organized in years. I heard about Edward constantly. Edward handled sponsor relations. Edward was managing stage logistics. Edward was apparently the only person at the company who actually understood how big events were supposed to run. It was not just how often she mentioned him. It was the tone she used when she did. At first I treated it like normal work talk. Betty had worked on plenty of events before, and there was always someone she mentioned a lot during the planning stage. But this was slightly different. Usually when Betty talked about coworkers, it came with criticism attached. Someone was slow. Someone did not understand the politics of the company. Someone needed her to fix their mistakes. With Edward, the tone was different. She still sounded irritated sometimes, but it came with this strange layer of admiration. She would say things like, "Edward is the only one here who actually understands how big events work." Or Edward had to redo half the planning because everyone else was useless. Then she would roll her eyes and complain about how exhausting he was to work with. It was a weird mix. Complaints on the surface, but a lot of attention underneath. The second change was her schedule. Corporate events obviously require long hours. So when Betty said she had late planning meetings for the gala, I did not question it at first. But those meetings started happening 3 or 4 nights a week. Sometimes she would text that she was grabbing drinks with the planning team after a meeting. Sometimes she would just say the meeting ran late. When she came home, she usually had something to say about Edward. Edward argued with the sponsors. Edward fixed a disaster with the lighting company. Edward apparently saved the entire event budget by renegotiating a contract. After a few weeks, it started to stand out how often his name came up compared to everyone else. One night we were having dinner, and Betty was complaining about work again. She said Edward was impossible to deal with because he thought he knew everything about event logistics. Then she followed it with a comment that stuck with me. She said at least he actually knows what he is doing, which is more than I can say for half the people in that office. The way she said it sounded less like irritation and more like reluctant respect. I did not accuse her of anything at that point, but I started noticing patterns. Her phone was suddenly always face down on the table. If a message came in while we were watching something, she would glance at it quickly and lock the screen again. The biggest change was how defensive she became about the gala. One evening, I casually asked if I could come to the event when it happened. She immediately said it was not really a spouse kind of event. That answer did not make much sense, because every other corporate gala she had worked on before allowed guests, and she knew I had attended one of them a few years earlier. That was the moment something in the back of my mind started paying much closer attention. After that conversation, I stopped treating the situation casually. I did not confront Betty. I did not accuse her of anything. At that point, all I had were small inconsistencies and a lot of mentions of one coworker. But I did start observing things more carefully. One detail that stood out was how protective she suddenly became about her phone. Betty had never been secretive with it before. We were not the kind of couple that checked each other's devices, but she had never acted like it contained classified information either. Now it barely left her hand. If she walked into the kitchen, the phone went with her. If she stepped into the bathroom, the phone went with her. When she left it on the table, it was always screened down. Another pattern showed up with her mood. Betty had always been blunt, but recently she had become noticeably more irritable with me over small things. One night, I asked a simple question about the gala timeline because she had been talking about it for weeks. She snapped and said if you had any idea how much work goes into events like this, you would not keep asking basic questions. That kind of response was new. Normally, she liked explaining her projects because it made her feel important. The strangest moment happened about 2 weeks before the event. I got home from work earlier than usual because a shipment had been canceled. When I walked into the house, Betty was sitting on the couch texting. She looked up and immediately locked the screen. Then she said, "You are home early," in a tone that sounded more surprised than pleased. I shrugged and told her about the canceled delivery. She relaxed after that, but the reaction stuck in my head. Later that evening, she mentioned Edward again. Apparently, they had spent most of the day finalizing sponsor seating and reviewing the stage schedule for the gala. Then she casually mentioned they were probably going to grab drinks after work the next night to go over final details. That was when I decided to test something simple. I asked if I could stop by the bar for a drink with them since it was close to my office. Betty immediately shut that down. She said it would be awkward because it was a work discussion and Edward was very focused about keeping the team professional. That explanation felt backwards, because the way she usually described Edward was anything but formal. At that point, I still did not have proof of anything. But the situation was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. I did not go looking for proof right away, at least not in the dramatic sense people imagine. There was no secret phone unlocking or digging through private accounts. Mostly, I just started paying attention to the things Betty had already told me. For example, she had mentioned the hotel where the gala was going to take place. It was a large venue near Center City that hosted a lot of corporate events. About 10 days before the event, Betty texted me during the afternoon and said she would be working late again. She said the final stage walkthrough was running longer than expected and the planning team was probably going out for drinks afterward. That message was almost identical to the ones she had sent several times already. Normally, I would have just accepted it, but that day something felt off. I finished work around 5 and drove towards Center City instead of going straight home. The hotel she mentioned had a restaurant and bar attached to it that was open to the public. I told myself I was just going to have a drink and clear my head. When I walked into the bar, I did not see Betty immediately. The place was busy and most of the tables were full of people in suits. Then I noticed them. Betty was sitting in a corner booth. Across from her was a guy I had never met before, but immediately knew had to be Edward. He looked exactly like the kind of confident event manager Betty always described. Expensive jacket, relaxed posture. The kind of guy who clearly enjoyed being the center of attention. They were not discussing sponsor contracts. They were sitting close together on the same side of the booth. Edward had his arm resting along the back of the seat behind her shoulders. Betty was leaning toward him while she talked. Then she laughed at something he said and put her hand on his arm. It was not ambiguous. That was not coworkers finishing a meeting. I stayed where I was for a minute, just watching. After a moment, Edward leaned in and kissed her. Not a quick mistake kind of kiss. The kind that people do when they are already comfortable doing it. That was the exact moment the situation became very simple in my mind. There was no confusion left. My wife was having an affair. The strange thing is I did not feel explosive anger the way people expect. What I felt instead was clarity. Once you see something like that with your own eyes, the mental debate disappears. I finished my drink, walked out of the bar, and drove home. And on the way home, I started thinking about the gala. After seeing Betty and Edward together, the situation stopped being a mystery. I knew exactly what I had seen in that bar. The next step was deciding what I was going to do about it. For the first evening, I did nothing. I went home, made dinner, and acted completely normal when Betty walked through the door a couple hours later. She talked about the gala planning like she always did. According to her, the entire week had been chaotic because the event was only days away. Edward came up in the conversation several times. Apparently, he had spent most of the day fixing mistakes made by the rest of the planning team. Betty sounded half annoyed and half impressed while describing it. Listening to her talk about him after what I had already seen was strange. She spoke about him like he was an exhausting coworker she had to deal with constantly. But now I knew the reality behind that story. The following morning, I did something practical. During my lunch break at work, I stepped outside the warehouse office and called a divorce attorney. I did not make the call impulsively. I had already thought about it for nearly 12 hours at that point, and the logic was simple. If my wife was having an affair, the smartest move was to handle the legal side before anything became messy. The attorney I reached specialized in family law here in Philadelphia. I explained the situation briefly and asked what the first steps usually looked like. He asked a few direct questions. Did we own property together? Did we have children? How long had we been married? The answers were straightforward. We owned the row house in South Philadelphia, and we had been married 7 years. No kids. The lawyer explained that Pennsylvania is technically a no-fault divorce state, which meant the affair itself would not dramatically change the legal process. But he also said something useful. He told me that if I was certain about ending the marriage, it was often better to prepare the paperwork before confronting the other person. That way the process started immediately instead of turning into weeks of arguments. By the end of that call, I had scheduled an in-person meeting for Thursday afternoon. The gala Betty had been obsessing over was scheduled for Saturday night. At that point, I already knew exactly where I was going to be that evening. On Thursday afternoon, I met the divorce lawyer in his office near Market Street. The meeting itself was straightforward and surprisingly calm. I explained the situation clearly. Married 7 years. Joint house. No children. Evidence of an affair, but no dramatic confrontation yet. He told me something I already suspected. In Pennsylvania, the affair itself would not create some dramatic legal advantage. The court would mostly care about dividing property fairly and finalizing the separation. What mattered more was timing and preparation. We went through the paperwork together. Financial disclosures, property details, and the initial divorce filing. The lawyer asked me one practical question near the end of the meeting. He asked when I planned to tell my wife. I told him about the gala on Saturday night. I explained that Betty had spent months organizing it and that she would be giving the closing speech in front of executives, donors, and media. He paused for a second when I said that. Then he asked if I was planning some kind of public confrontation. I told him I was not interested in screaming or causing a scene. What I wanted was something very simple. Clarity. The lawyer nodded and told me that legally I could serve divorce papers whenever I wanted. There was no rule about it needing to happen privately. By the end of the meeting, he prepared the initial divorce documents. I left his office with the papers in a sealed envelope. Friday evening at home was completely normal. Betty was in full event mode. She spent most of the night reviewing schedules on her laptop and texting members of the planning team. Edward's name came up again. Apparently, he was coordinating the stage timing and handling last-minute sponsor requests. Betty sounded impressed by how much control he had over the event logistics. At one point, she even said something that made the entire situation feel absurd. She said Edward was the only person she trusted to keep things from falling apart. I listened and nodded. Saturday afternoon, Betty left the house early to go to the venue. She looked excited, confident, completely focused on the event she had been planning for months. About an hour later, I got dressed, picked up the envelope from the kitchen counter, and drove into Center City. The ballroom was already filling with guests when I arrived, and it did not take long to spot Betty near the stage. Edward was standing right beside her. Seeing them together in the ballroom confirmed something I had already accepted earlier that week. Betty and Edward were clearly operating as a unit. They stood close together near the stage while staff members moved around them, setting up microphones and adjusting lighting. Every few minutes, someone would approach Betty with a question, and she would answer while Edward listened beside her like they were co-hosting the entire event. From across the room, it was easy to see how confident she looked. Betty thrived in environments like that. Formal events, professional attention, rooms where people treated her like someone important. Edward looked comfortable there too. He had the relaxed posture of someone who believed he belonged exactly where he was standing. I kept my distance and found a table near the back of the ballroom. The gala itself ran exactly the way Betty had described it during the previous weeks. Sponsors gave short remarks. The charity director spoke about the programs being funded. Waiters moved between tables with trays of drinks while people in suits made polite conversation. At one point, I saw Betty and Edward leave the main floor together and disappear into a hallway near the stage. They came back about 10 minutes later laughing about something. Most of the guests probably saw two co-workers managing an event. I saw something different. Around 9:30, the formal program started moving toward the closing section. A company executive spoke about the fundraising total and thanked the sponsors who had supported the event. Then he introduced Betty. He described her as the driving force behind the entire gala and praised her leadership in organizing the night. People in the room applauded as she walked onto the stage. Betty looked exactly the way she always wanted to look in public settings. Confident, polished, completely in control. Edward stood near the side of the stage watching her with a satisfied expression. Betty stepped up to the microphone and began the speech I had already heard pieces of at home. She talked about teamwork. She talked about the generosity of the donors. She talked about how proud she was of the people who helped make the event possible. I waited quietly at my table while she finished, because I had already decided that I was not interrupting her speech. I was going to let Betty have her moment first. And when the applause started, that was when I stood up. The applause lasted longer than I expected. Betty stood on the stage smiling while the room clapped. She looked proud of herself, and honestly from a distance the event did look successful. The ballroom was full, the donors seemed happy, and the executives were clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. Edward was standing near the side of the stage watching her like he was just as proud. When the applause started to settle, Betty stepped slightly away from the microphone like the program was finished. That was when I started walking toward the stage. No one really paid attention at first. A few people were still clapping, and others were already standing up from their tables. By the time I reached the front of the room, Betty noticed me. Her expression shifted immediately. First confusion, then irritation, then something closer to alarm. She clearly had not expected to see me there. I stepped onto the stage calmly. One of the event staff members looked like they were about to stop me, but Betty raised a hand slightly like she recognized me. Into the microphone, she said something like, "This is my husband, Matthew." The audience responded with polite, scattered applause. Most people probably assumed this was some kind of planned moment. I took the microphone from the stand. I kept my voice calm because I was not interested in yelling or making a dramatic scene. I simply said that I wanted to congratulate Betty on organizing such a successful event. That part was genuine. Then I said there was one more thing I needed to do tonight. The room went quiet very quickly. I turned slightly toward Edward and said his name. That got everyone's attention. I explained that earlier that week I had stopped by the hotel bar and happened to see my wife and Edward spending time together. Not as co-workers, as a couple. You could feel the shift in the room immediately. People stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Betty tried to interrupt me, but I kept talking. I said that since the two of them had already decided to start their relationship, it only seemed fair that the final step happened tonight as well. Then I pulled the envelope out of my jacket and placed the divorce papers on the podium in front of her. For a few seconds after I put the envelope on the podium, the entire room stayed completely silent. Betty stared at the papers like her brain needed time to process what had just happened. Her face had gone pale in a way I had never seen before. Edward looked like someone had just turned the lights on in a room he thought was private. A couple of people in the front rows started whispering to each other. Someone near the back actually let out a quiet laugh before quickly stopping. Betty finally leaned toward the microphone again. She said, "Matthew, what the hell are you doing?" Her voice was sharp and angry, but underneath it there was panic. I did not raise my voice. I just answered normally. I said I was finishing a conversation that she had already started earlier in the week. Then I said I saw the two of you in the hotel bar on Tuesday. That part landed hard. Betty glanced toward Edward for half a second. It was a quick look, but it said everything about how unprepared they were for this situation. She immediately switched tactics. She told the room there was some kind of misunderstanding and that I was being dramatic. The problem with that explanation was simple. I calmly described exactly what I saw. The corner booth. The two of them sitting on the same side. The kiss. At that point, several people in the audience were openly watching Edward instead of Betty. He had not said a single word. He just stood there near the stage looking like he wished the floor would open under his feet. Betty tried to grab the envelope from the podium, but I slid it slightly toward her. I told her the papers were already prepared by a lawyer and that she would be hearing from him on Monday. Then I said something that was honestly the only reason I had waited for the speech to finish. I told her she clearly valued this event and the people in this room. So I figured it was the appropriate place to be honest about what was actually happening. The room had that strange quiet you get when a professional environment suddenly turns personal. I stepped away from the microphone. Before leaving the stage, I said one last thing. I told Betty she was free to keep working with Edward as much as she wanted. Just not as my wife anymore. After I stepped off the stage, I did not stay to watch the aftermath. There was no point. People were already whispering to each other, and several guests were looking back and forth between Betty and Edward like they had just witnessed something they would be talking about for weeks. I walked straight through the ballroom and out into the hotel lobby. About 30 seconds after I reached the front entrance, my phone started vibrating. Betty. I watched the screen ring for a moment and then declined the call. A second later, she called again. Then again. By the time I reached my car, there were already 3 missed calls and 2 messages waiting. I did not open them. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat for a minute and finished the last step of the process. First, I blocked her number. Then I blocked her on every messaging app we used. After that, I blocked her on social media. Some people might think that sounds extreme, but it was actually the cleanest option. There was nothing left to discuss. I had already spoken to the lawyer. The paperwork was done. The next communication between us would go through legal channels anyway. Driving away from the hotel that night felt strangely calm. Instead of going back to the house, I drove straight to a short-term apartment I had rented earlier that week. It was a small 1-bedroom place across the river in New Jersey, nothing fancy, but quiet and fully furnished. I had arranged it after meeting with the lawyer because I knew things would get complicated once Betty realized the marriage was actually ending. Having my own place removed that entire argument. The apartment was simple. A couch, a bed, a small kitchen, and a view of the parking lot. But it was peaceful, which was exactly what I needed. On Monday, my lawyer officially filed the paperwork. From that point forward, everything moved through him. I never had another direct conversation with Betty after that night. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, the gala became memorable for reasons that had nothing to do with fundraising. Edward apparently transferred to a different office a couple months later. Betty stayed with the company for a while, but the situation at work became uncomfortable enough that she eventually left too. As for me, life became quieter again, which honestly was exactly what I wanted from the beginning. Bye-bye.